All right, good night. Oh, good night. Yeah, good night. All right. Well, we've started off real well tonight, haven't we? Oh, turn your Bibles to Mark chapter 8, verse 31. Mark 8, verse 31. I don't know about you, but I can come after that. Hey, Anna. How you doing, bud? Mark chapter 8, Jesus has just spent a little time, if you will, by the time we get to verse 31. He's just spent a little time with Peter and the others. Peter's made the great confession. You're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And after that is what happens next. After that is what we want to study tonight. And it is some interesting, if you will, thoughts. It is sad what happens in a lot of ways, but in other ways, I think we can say, well, that's an understandable thing, and yet we can't cut Peter any slack. One of the things that we know about Peter is that Peter was quite impetuous. Somewhere between getting up here, I've gotten something on my glasses, and so if I spit on here in a minute, y'all don't think nothing about it. But right now I'm having to look around, and I don't like to look around a spot. I have enough floaters as it is. But we look at Peter, and we know that Peter was usually the one that spoke first. Peter was always the impetuous one. He was the one that spoke up and spoke first. And tonight he's going to rebuke Jesus. And bless you. You're welcome. And as he rebukes Jesus, we say, well, you know, if we were in the crowd and we were watching that, we'd say, oh, there goes old Peter. He did it again. He stepped in it again. But yet at the same point in time too, we look at it and say, not just from the standpoint of there goes Peter again, but what was Peter thinking? Peter had just made the great confession that you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. But let's see what happens. Mark chapter 8, beginning verse 31. And he began to teach, Jesus that is the he. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, and chief priests, and scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke this word openly. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when he had turned around and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, Get behind me, Satan, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of man. Jesus begins to teach. There are a couple of things that are noteworthy when you begin to think about the ministry of Jesus Christ. One is that really we don't pick it up, and we haven't been able to pick it up in Mark's account like you can find in Matthew's account. But in Matthew's account, one of the things that we see is that Jesus, especially during the Galilean time, is pointing towards Jerusalem. He's got to get back to Jerusalem. And, of course, ultimately for his death. But also, we find out through Luke's account that Jesus quite readily talked about his death, burial, and resurrection to the apostles. And they, even when it happened, didn't get it. They didn't understand it. And this is true now as Jesus began to teach them about that. Now notice several things. Notice first of all that he began to teach them that the Son of Man, this is a term that Jesus used on several occasions in reference to himself, which sort of denotes his deity, but also his humanity. That he is the Son of God, yes, but he is the Son of Man, and so that he is human as well. Son of God in that he's deity, yes, but Son of Man in that he is also fleshly. He is man. He is 100% man. And so he tells them, I'm going to die. Now, I want us to just stop right there and put ourselves, if you will, in Peter's shoes for just a minute. And when you begin to do that, or when I begin to do this, it helps me to understand that Peter is looking at this and thinking, okay, I just left my livelihood. I've left my family. And I'm following a man that I believe to be right. Now, we're giving Peter the benefit of the doubt here because Peter, remember, made the great confession. I believe to be right, and I'm following this man, and now all of a sudden he's predicting that he is fixing to die, which probably means that if he dies at the hands of men, that I'm going to die too, because they're going to take not just him, but they're going to take everybody that's with him, all of his followers, and they're going to put them to death as well. And I don't want that. And so Peter then, it says, takes Jesus off to the side. And when he takes Jesus off to the side, notice the last part of verse 32 says, and he began to rebuke him. Now, something to catch in this is that this is not just Peter took Jesus off to the side and said, hey, Jesus, let's calm this speech down. Let's calm this talk down about dying. No, this is a strong, this rebuke here is a strong word. Now, Jesus is going to rebuke. Look at verse 33. It says he rebuked Peter. It's the same word in the Greek text. But it's not just a, hey, let's calm this down. He takes him off to the side and he scolds him pretty good. No, we're not going to have any of this. We're not going to talk about this. Let's drop this subject. You cool it. You quit. But Jesus, in hearing the rebuke of Peter, verse 33, answers Peter this way. Get behind me, Satan. It's interesting is that he would even refer to one of his followers as Satan. But in the rebuke of Peter, if Peter could have stopped Jesus, if the rebuke had been enough, now it wasn't, because Jesus, the Son of God, he wasn't going to stop. Jesus was all about doing what God had told him to do, right? And so he wasn't going to stop him, but yet in playing this role, if you'll allow me that loose terminology, he's playing the role of Satan in that he is saying, you need to stop. Well, what was Jesus' mission? What did Jesus come for? Save his people, right? And the prophets had prophesied how that would take place. Remember, the prophets prophesied about the death of Jesus. They prophesied about Judas betraying him. They prophesied about him dying and being disfigured when he died, according to Isaiah 53. They talked about how he would die. And so all of this is known. And if at all, and even though they question from time to time, many times as we've seen already in the study of Mark, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. They're beginning to put the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together and say, oh, the prophecies that my mama and my grandmama and granddaddy and daddy taught me about this Jesus, this is the one. This is not going to end well. But Jesus says, you're trying to stop the mission. And so get behind me, Satan. The word Satan has the idea of being a deceiver. And so Jesus portrays Peter as playing the role for Satan, which we know that one of the tools of Satan is false teachers. For you are full of the things of God, but the things of man. You're not thinking spiritually. You're thinking physically. You're not thinking about why I came and what my purpose is. You're thinking about what's going to happen physically. Probably not just to me, but to you as well, Peter. And so Jesus rebukes Peter. Anything in those few verses, there's It's a great thought. The thought in many ways for us, if you want to go down that road for just a minute, is the fact that we need to be careful where we stand. And we need to be careful what we're doing with regards to the work that we're involved in, the ministries that we're involved in. Are we building them up or tearing them down? That's a tough question that needs to be asked. Well, let's go on, verse 34. Verse 34 through the end of the chapter. When he had called the people to himself, Jesus this is, when Jesus had called the people to himself, with his disciples also, he said to them, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man also will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. There's not a lot of words there, but there's a lot of teaching there. Jesus always said so much in so few words. Look at how he begins. Whoever. That narrows it down to no one, right? But includes everyone. Male, female, young, old. In vernacular of New Testament times, Jew, Gentile. Includes anyone and everyone. Whoever desires, whoever wants to come after me. Here's what he's got to do. He's got to deny himself, and he's got to take up his cross. And he's got to follow me. Denial of self. We understand in standpoint of Christianity the idea of what? Control, right? But self-denial is a little different than self-control. Self-control is what? It's the idea of holding yourself back, right? It's that control you have when you go on a diet. Or you're mad at somebody. Yeah, you don't do something to them. That's a good one. If you're on a diet, you're mad. You're more than mad. But what is self-denial? That's where self becomes smaller, right? And in this case, God becomes greater. God becomes the one that you answer to. Self-denial says, I'm not the most important thing. God is. And so, Jesus says, deny himself. Take up his cross. The Romans practiced crucifixion quite readily. And really it could have come, and history tells us that it possibly came from the Persians, who, when they wanted to discipline somebody or hurt somebody or kill somebody, they knew how to do it. If you go back in history. The Romans, New Testament times, were notorious for crucifying people. There's one point in history would have been a little bit before the public ministry time of Jesus, in which the Romans took and literally crucified thousands. So the understanding of crucifixion and crucifying oneself was very much understood. And so when Peter says, let him deny himself and take up his cross, these folks realize what the cross means. The cross would represent what? Death, right? death of self. In New Testament times, when an individual was crucified, they were crucified right outside the city gates. And oftentimes, as you go back and look at Jesus, an individual that was to be crucified would carry not literally the whole cross, but usually the crossbar of the cross, as Jesus did, and carry it outside the gates. You would carry it's sort of like when your folks disciplined you, did they ever tell you, go get the switch and bring it to me? Well, my folks didn't use a switch, and there's a reason for that. They used what we called a rick-rack paddle. And sometimes I just soon had a switch, I guess. But the criminals would carry part of their cross out to the city, outside the city. And so this taking up of the cross is the idea of, okay, you're going to take up where you're fixing to be. And Jesus is not saying you're going to be punished for following me. But what you're doing is you're taking up your cross knowing that you're dying to self. That self is no longer the first. It is no longer the important thing in your life. That you're going to be willing then to endure everything that's going to come your way, even to the point of death. You're going to be willing to endure the persecution, the rejection, the heartaches, the hurt, the martyrship and the martyrdom that's going to come. And notice what he says. You're going to follow me. You've died to self, so you've got to fill yourself with something. Well, who is it? Well, it's Jesus. True, complete, utter submission to the Lord. That's not always easy, is it? We want to do, right? Who doesn't? I want to do what I want to do. And so Jesus says, if you want to come after me, whoever, here's what it's going to take. You're going to have to lose your life. And if you lose your life, notice what he says, verse 35 is what they call a paradox. In other words, it seemingly is different than what reality is, but nevertheless, it is that which is true. Whoever desires to save his life will lose it. It's not my brain knows what I want to say, but my mouth's not saying it. Jesus is not saying that literally one's going to lose their physical life. Now, did a lot of folks, and yet even today, do a lot of folks lose their life for being Christians? Yeah. But the teaching here is that you've got to be willing to give your life in service. You've got to be willing to give your life up. You've got to be willing to give your all. And as you give your all, he says, you're going to save your life. You give your life, you lose your life, verse 35, for my sake and the gospel's. Because of me and the truth. And he says, look what he says. What does he say? Verse 35, the end of it. He says, what will happen to you? You'll save it, right? What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Here's another way of asking that question. What are you living for? What are you living for? And that sometimes gets very cloudy, doesn't it? And here's the reason. Do you think you're right? It doesn't matter what it is. Do you think you're right? All of us think we're right, correct? And it's not until we're shown that we're wrong and then convinced that we're wrong that we'll finally admit, well, I was wrong, and now I'm thinking right. You know, sometimes Suzanne will show me where I was in error. And then we just walk away. I don't want to tell her that, yeah, you were right, I was wrong. We all think we're right. Or we wouldn't do, we wouldn't say, we wouldn't be the way we are. And so when it's always interesting to me that people have always said with regards to the Church of Christ, where they're the only ones who think they're going to heaven. They're the only ones who think they're right. And if anybody ever asks you that, just ask them, well, don't you think you're right? Well, yeah. Okay, well, we need to find out what right is. That's the issue. But Jesus here is teaching the idea that when you give yourself over, you're going to gain. If you have the whole world, you're not gaining. What profit is it if you gain the whole world and you lose your own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? What are you going to swap for your soul? In thinking that you're right and doing that you're right, you have to ask yourself, am I really right? Now, it's easy to figure out. Oh, no, it's not, preacher. Yeah, it is. Just go to the Bible. Am I doing what the Bible says? And if I'm not, why not? Am I doing what I want to do out of rebellion and want of self? Or am I doing it because I was mistaken and now I'm willing to change my ways? Now, catch the thought. Catch the last few words of that sentence. Change my ways. That's repentance. There's a lot of folks that say, oh yeah, I'm willing to change. No. Did you really change? Jesus says here, don't give the world a second chance and fall in love with the world. Be willing to love your soul so much that you give your soul to the Lord. And that's what's important, not the world. For whoever, verse 38, is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, to him the Son of Man, and notice there's that term again, Son of Man, also will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Jesus says, if you're ashamed of me and my words, I don't have an answer for what I'm about to say. Maybe I'm reading a little bit too much into this. But I want you to think for just a second. Was Jesus making reference back to what Peter had done a little earlier when he rebuked him and said, Lord, don't talk about dying this way? I don't have an answer for that. But I will say this, that I think that Jesus has that, but everything else. All the denials. And not just the apostles' denials, but the world's denials. Jesus is teaching now the priority of life. And Jesus says, I must be first in your life. And so, he says, notice what he says. He says, the Son of Man also will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Who will he be ashamed of? Those that are ashamed of him. And so, the call to commitment is made. The call to commitment and giving of one's life up. Now, if Peter had in mind when he rebuked Jesus that it was not just the fact that Jesus was going to die, but he was going to die with him, here's what the Lord is basically saying to Peter and to anyone else that was thinking along that line with Peter. You better be ready. because it might happen. Now, let's make an application for us, for ourselves today. We're not too often called upon to say, hey, where do you stand? We tell folks we're a Christian. We live in a nation that accepts that. Says, okay, you're a Christian. Good. We're glad you are. But if we lived in a different world, a different part of the world, or simply put, when we're called upon to be different, are we different? Are we the shining light that we're supposed to be? The cost that we're going to have to pay is great. Luke 14, Luke's account of this. Luke talks about counting the cost. That which of you, by taking thought, or which of you fixing to go out and build a tower does not sit down first and count the cost to see whether he has sufficient to finish it? Lest, happily, what happens when he's finished, but he's not finished? He becomes a laughingstock, right? Jesus said, Luke's account was, Jesus says you got to sit down and count the costs. There's a lot of folks that like the idea of salvation, but few are willing to pay the price. And that's tough. It is tough. I tell people that it's tough. I know this was one night. It was one night. I was called actually during the day. This is years ago. I was called during the day by a lady. Paul, yes. Can you meet me and my family down at the church building tonight? Sure. Do you mind telling me what I'm meeting you for? I have a grandson and a granddaughter that wants to be baptized. Wonderful. I'd never met the grandson. I never met the granddaughter. And so we were talking, and I said, where do your grandson and granddaughter go to church? They don't. Okay. Well, to make a long story short, basically, Granddad, who had a lot of money, had pushed grandson and granddaughter to be baptized. So I sat down with them that night before. I took them into my office and I sat down with them before I baptized them, and I explained to them what they were fixing to start and what they were fixing to get into. And I asked them, do you understand? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I leave it in the hands of God, but I'll say this. To my knowledge, when they walked out of the doors that evening, they had been baptized. They had gotten wet. But as far as I know, they never darkened the door of any church at all. Never did anything religiously again. That's a concept that a lot of folks have. But that's not what Christianity is all about. Now, I leave all that in the hands of God. I will not judge them other than to say that from what I saw fruit-wise, I fear for them. But that's what God calls upon us to do, to understand that we are called, there's a cost, and there's commitment that comes about, and ultimately comes about because of our conviction. Anything else? Well, yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. The good news, the death, burial, and resurrection.
He knows what's going to happen, but human community has already got a bit over their head because they would say,
yeah. Yeah, that was, well, no, I think that's a valid point because that would have always been the case. They would have never seen what, or they would have never truly, completely, I think maybe is the word I'm looking for, understood till after all this happened. That he's saying the good news, and they're probably going, okay, but, and I have no way of knowing this, I'm wondering how much of what he told them was the good news. He had just told them of his death, burial, and resurrection. Yeah, I don't know that he called it gospel. So, but from the standpoint of, did he tell them? Yes. Did they understand? Did they put it all together? Probably not. Probably not. All right, let me answer this. I probably wouldn't have. Anything else? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that's great. Here, you've got the keys to the kingdom.
Yeah.
You know, that had to take Peter to the highest emotion he had ever felt in his life. And then in the very next step, he said, but Peter, I don't think it's going to do anything for you there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I wonder why Mark didn't let us see that.
Yeah.
Didn't let the Gentile readers see that.
Well, I think that's what you hit upon. The different readers, the Gentile readers that Mark had, as opposed to the Roman readers that Matthew had. They came at it from two different worlds.
Do you think Peter really ever understood the gospel for the Gentiles? Did it ever really sink in that we refer to Peter as the apostle to the Jews and Paul as the apostle to the Gentiles? You know, sometimes we look at Peter and we think, and I hope I'll never like Peter, but there's a lot of times where I can relate to it.
Yes.
He wrote it.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Much so. Very much so. I think that I don't know what was in Peter's mind, because when you go, say, to Acts 2 to Acts 10, or really, 12, to see Peter in the book of Acts, where is his ministry? His ministry is Jerusalem, Judea, and Galilee. It's Paul that carries it to the uttermost parts of the world. So his ministry was limited into where it was. The question is one that I don't know that I have an answer for. That how much of it did Peter put together? But Peter was a tremendous force within the church, because then you get over in 1 Peter chapter 5, he's an elder in the church. So he was well thought of enough, and how do you say this? He was a man of Scripture enough that he was made an elder in the church. But he stayed pretty much to a select people, as opposed to going everywhere and with everybody. So it's a great question that I don't have an answer for. With regards to, and I know you know this, but I'm just going to remind you, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's all one gospel. It's It's Matthew's account of the gospel. It's Mark's account of the gospel. It's Luke's account of the gospel. And it's John's account of the gospel. It's not the gospel according to Matthew. It's not the gospel according to Luke. It's not the gospel according to John. It's all one gospel. It's just Matthew's account, Mark's account, Luke's account, and John's account. And they had different audiences to which they were writing. And also they came from different backgrounds. Matthew has the most chapters. Luke has the most words. He was a doctor. He was kind of verbose. And so you have difference. John came from the aspect of, while there are more than 7 miracles in the book of John, but John's whole purpose for writing his account, the way he wrote it, was to produce belief. Many other signs, remember John 20 verses 30 and 31, many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book, but these things are written that you might believe. And there are especially 7 miracles in the book of John that he centers all of what he has to say around. And so his idea was, well, let me produce faith, do it through miracles. Whereas Mark's account was through miracles as well, as we've seen, but he had a different audience. And so that's the reason I account for the differences in what is said in Matthew as opposed to, say, Luke or Mark or John. So, anything else? It's all good. Makes me think. I appreciate that. Well, I know time's passed, but I just want to look at chapter 9, verse 1. It's my belief that this probably went with the 8th chapter. And then verse 2 really, in many ways, could have been where Stephanus, when he was dividing the Bible into chapters and verses, Stephanus divided it into chapters, where he would should have started. Next, it says, verse 1 of the 9th chapter, he said to them, "Assuredly, I say to you, that there are some standing here who will not taste death till they see the kingdom of God present with power." This is just a statement of fact that the kingdom's going to come. What is the kingdom? It's the church, right? And so he makes the statement, he says, there's coming a time in which the kingdom's coming. Now, go back to the statement that Jim made, which is not found per se in Mark's account, but is found in Matthew's account, where he gave him the keys to the kingdom. He says, now, I've given you the keys to the kingdom, and I want you to know the kingdom's going to come while some of you are still here. There's a lot of folks that have this misteaching, and they are missing the teaching with regards to what the kingdom is. For some, the kingdom is that which is within us. That Christ is the king, and if he is our king, then we are the kingdom, and kingdom is the idea of kingdom rule within us. Well, there is a point in which that is correct. But then you have to remember that the kingdom itself are all Christians. And Christ has, because he is the king, has rule over it. Now, Peter had the keys in that he was able, according to Acts 2, to preach the first gospel sermon. He stood up and preached it with all the other apostles, but we have his account of it. Now Jesus says, I want you to know, when the kingdom comes, some of you are going to still be here. This tells us what? Well, the premillennialists that tell us the kingdom is yet to be, that the kingdom will be established when the Lord comes again, the second coming, can't be right. Or there's a lot of us that think we're old, that we're ancient. Because he says, there's some of you right here, and right here at that point in time would have been, depending upon how you want to view the calendar, but around late AD 28, early AD 29. Jesus crucified in AD 30. Now, some would say 33. I know it depends on how you want to look at the calendar. But a long time. There's nobody that old. So the kingdom will come, and of course it did come in Acts chapter 2. Any questions or comments? Does that make you completely confused? Well, all right. Well, that's a great place to start is verse 2, because next week we get to talk about the Transfiguration, and that's a wonderful lesson that I always enjoyed when I was a child. Do you remember the flannel studies, the flannel boards? Yeah. I remember them tremendously well, and that was I always enjoyed seeing the flannel boards go up and the flannel stories, especially with the Transfiguration. So we'll talk about that next week. Thank you. Ken's got the file.